Today's webinar is titled Legislative Update on COVID-19 Relief Legislation. A massive $2 trillion bill, the CARES Act, was passed last week by Congress and signed into law by President Trump. The bill provides billions in financial relief to small and large businesses through loans and tax credits. The president has indicated these loans will begin to be offered to applicants as early as this Friday. More information about the various loans you can find at NUCA.com/recovery. While no 30-minute webinar can cover all aspects of a 1,200-page bill, our presenter, Eben Wyman, will focus like a laser on the parts that affect utility construction companies and what is in the bill that can help your business. Eben Wyman of E. Wyman Associates represents NUCA's interest in Congress and the federal regulatory agencies across Washington. As the principal of the firm, Eben delivers more than 30 years of experience to underground infrastructure policy discussions. From 2000 to 2012, Eben Wyman worked for NUCA on a broad range of legislative and regulatory matters important to the membership. Thanks for joining us, Eben. Doug Carlson, NUCA's Chief Executive Officer, is also joining us today to introduce our webinar guest speaker. Doug will also share with you some of the resources NUCA is making available to our members to overcome this adverse economic environment. Please welcome Doug Carlson.
Thank you, Bob, and thank you to all of our members and guests joining us today. Just a quick shout out and to thank you to our business partner, CNA, for sponsoring this webinar series. We greatly appreciate, could not do that without their help, so thank you, CNA. NUCA is committed to providing our members with as much information as possible, especially in today's situation, regarding the national response to today's coronavirus pandemic. There's obviously a lot going on, as many of you know, and there are several legislative measures that are already in place. Once again, as Bob mentioned before, plug NUCA.com/panflu and NUCA.com/recovery, where you can find the most up-to-date, relevant information available. More legislation is expected in the weeks ahead, particularly focusing on infrastructure. While the details of this legislation are still emerging, NUCA will be at the forefront of these discussions. Infrastructure is critical to our members and the country. Congress will definitely be hearing from us firsthand through our lobbying and our advocacy efforts. The discussion of what compromises essential workers also continues at the federal and state levels. NUCA has been pushing to keep utility contractors front and center of that conversation as we keep America water and sewer running. On our PanFlu page is our letter to the Department of Homeland Security. And also earlier, you probably received a memo from me to all members on this issue. But in this webinar, Eben Wyman and NUCA's government relations team will provide updates on the information available and answer questions to the best of their ability about Congress and the administration's response to the fast-moving public health and economic crisis. Please welcome Eben Wyman.
Thank you, Doug, and good afternoon, everybody. To say there's a lot going on right now and lots happening quickly would be a true understatement. And I can tell you right now that the construction industry, particularly the folks that keep the water running, keep the lights on, and ensuring that we have broadband service while we're quarantined are essential. And we're doing everything we can to make sure federal and state authorities know that. So today I'm going to run through the 3 stimulus bills that have passed already. What's currently being looked at in what's known as Stimulus 4, where there is, as Doug mentioned, increasing talk about significant infrastructure investment, and then talk about the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency and its federal guidance on what they call essential critical infrastructure workforce. And I was joking with a friend of mine in the federal government. I said, it's a federal program when the first 2 words of the initiative mean the same thing. Then we'll go to Q&A, where I can almost promise you I will not be able to answer most of your questions because right now the federal government can't answer most of your questions. Now that said, if we can capture your questions, and I know Bob's going to help with that, you can count on us to get you answers when they are available. And as always, NUCA members and the chapter executives out there can always reach out to me directly. So with that, let's get into the first one. First stimulus bill, the Coronavirus Preparedness and Response Supplemental Appropriations Act, passed on March 5th, overwhelmingly in the House and Senate, talking over $8 billion in funding, $3.1 billion to stockpile medical supplies, another $3 100 million in purchases of testing devices, vaccines, and therapies, $500 million for Medicare spending on telehealth programs for the coronavirus, and another $1.25 billion to combat the spread of the virus overseas, kind of playing ball with our allies overseas. Important to us, this unlocks about $7 billion in low interest loans to small businesses affected by COVID-19 and administered through the Small Business Administration. The second bill, this is the Family First bill. This is the one that has mandatory family leave and sick leave. Again, passed the House and Senate overwhelmingly, signed into law on the 18th of March. On the emergency family leave side, private sector employers with fewer than 500 workers and all government entities will have to provide as many as 12 weeks of job protected leave under the Family and Medical Leave Act for employees who are unable to work or telework because they have to care for a child younger than 18 whose school or daycare center was closed because of COVID-19. For the remainder of that period, workers would receive family leave from their employers. It would be at least 2/3 of their normal pay rate, capped at $200 a day, or a total of $10,000 total. On the emergency leave side, kind of the same deal here, folks. Private companies with less than 500 and all government entities would have to provide employees who can't work or telework with immediate paid sick leave off to comply with the quarantine or isolation order, self-quarantine per doctor's orders or advice from other healthcare providers, get tested for COVID-19, or care for somebody in quarantine or a child whose school or daycare center had been closed because of this pandemic. Full-time employees would receive 80 hours of sick leave, and part-time folks would be granted time off equivalent to their schedule or normal work hours over a 2-week period. And workers would have to be paid at least their normal wage or the federal, state, or local minimum wage, whichever is greater. And the leave assistance would be capped at $5,110 for workers quarantined and capped at $2,000 for another individual or child. Now, here's what's important. What employers cannot do, and this is subject to civil penalties, you can't require a worker to use available paid leave before using sick time. You can't require them to find a replacement to cover their work during sick leave, or fire or discriminate against a worker for requesting paid sick time or filing a related complaint against the employer. Now, there are exemptions, or potential exemptions, I should say. Under this legislation, or now law, the Department of Labor is allowed to issue regulations that would exempt small businesses with fewer than 50 from the paid sick leave and family leave requirements if it would, and this is important, jeopardize the viability of the business. This would also, if DOL issues this, and they are expected to do so, would exempt employers with fewer than 25 workers from requirements to restore an employee's original position if it no longer exists because of economic conditions or changes to operations due to this public health emergency. The employer would have to make reasonable efforts to restore the employee to at least an equivalent position if that's possible. Now, employers under this would be reimbursed, or would be able to be reimbursed for the full amount within 3 months in the form of a payroll tax credit. But the Trump administration has indicated they'll try to advance that money earlier for employers that cannot wait that long. How that's going to work, I don't know. This would also cover the employer's contribution to health insurance programs during that leave period. As of right now, these leave provisions are scheduled to expire at the end of this year. Just like everything else, all subject to change and depends on what's going to happen over the next several months. Now, lots of good resources out there. You're going to see a lot of this, and I know Bob talked about this. I'm going to tell you what I know, and I'm going to summarize most of this, but I encourage you to take the information on these slides and look for a lot of information here. DOL, the feds do have some good information out there. So these websites, don't bother writing it down. These slides will be available. But that's what we have on the first 2 stimulus packages. Now we'll talk about the big kahuna, Stimulus 3. This is the CARES Act. This is what was passed last week, $2 trillion in loans and assistance to companies and state and local governments, expanded unemployment benefits, significant dollars for small business loans, of course, direct payments to individual taxpayers, and financial assistance to state and local governments. So the CARES Act really expands unemployment benefits by increasing them by $600 a week over the current level in each state, with the goal of trying to make up for 100% of lost wages. The act will create what they're calling, it's a temporary pandemic unemployment assistance program for independent contractors, freelance folks and other gig economy workers who are not normally eligible for unemployment. And this is, reading about this is really considered a lifeline for younger workers, independent freelance folks who we're seeing more of in the workforce. Checks will continue up to 39 weeks, which is up from the previous maximum of 26. And the feds will cover the usual 1 week waiting period between applying for benefits and when they actually begin. So $500 billion for loans and financial assistance to businesses as well as state and local governments, including, and this is controversial, about $30 billion in a bailout for U.S. airlines and related aviation businesses, although stock buybacks and executive compensation would be restricted for recipients. And then importantly for us, just about $350 billion in low interest small business loans that could be partially or even fully forgiven under certain circumstances. And then another $100 billion for hospitals and other healthcare facilities, $150 billion in aid to state and local entities. Businesses are eligible for a tax credit if they keep idled workers on the payroll for the duration of this pandemic, and as long as they meet certain criteria. Employers at the risk of closure due to the coronavirus epidemic can receive a payroll tax credit against eligible payroll taxes for each quarter equal to half of the qualified wages paid to each employee. And credits available to employers whose operations were shut down completely or partially suspended because of an order from a government authority, or businesses that can prove it took a 50% loss compared to the same quarter in the previous year. A tax refund for half of what is spent on wages up to $5,000 per employee. And it's important to note that those opting for the tax credit will not be eligible for the special loans administered by the SBA, which we're going to talk about right now. So SBA has established the Paycheck Protection Program. This is designed to provide a direct incentive for small businesses to keep their folks on payroll by providing small business loans for payroll and other certain other expenses. If all employees are kept on the payroll for 8 weeks, SBA will forgive a portion of the loan used for payroll, rent, mortgage, interest, or utilities. Eligible businesses and some eligible nonprofits, sole proprietorships, the self-employed and independent contractors, all with 500 or fewer employees may apply. And certain businesses in certain industries that have more than 500 might meet size standards for those industries, could apply for this. Mostly, from what I understand, we're talking about restaurants. Small business loans would be available up to $10 million to cover payroll and certain other expenses. Loans are supposed to be, I think as Bob or Doug mentioned, available Friday, April 3rd. We'll see if that happens. They are shooting for that. New loans will apply to costs incurred retroactive from February 15th of this year through June 30th. Forgiveness is, and this is important, loan forgiveness is possible for companies that are able to keep their employees on payroll throughout the COVID-19 crisis. Payroll costs for individuals below $100,000 in annual income, mortgage and rent obligations, including interest and utility payments. Also important, the amount of forgiveness will be reduced if your workforce is drawn down through attrition, wear and tear, or if wages are reduced. And if you're forced, on the upside, if you're forced to lay off employees because of economic conditions, you may be able to preserve some of that loan guarantee by hiring them back. Specifics are not out there on that yet. And the eligibility for loan forgiveness starts 8 weeks before the loan origination date. Maximum rate is 4%. And again, this would cover payroll, mortgage, rental, rent payments, healthcare benefits, including sick leave. And it's said to possibly cover other interest on other debts. We just don't have specifics on that yet. Other stipulations to keep in mind: company has to be in business as of February 15th. There are criminal penalties associated with submitting false information on SBA loan applications. Applicants can still receive funding if the business has an outstanding loan with SBA or other pending insurance claims. And looking at this is basically a new program with significant funding built on existing SBA models. It's really just putting a lot of money on top of what's currently out there in terms of how this is going to work. So again, if I have confused you, I'm sure I've kind of confused myself writing all this. There are lots of resources out there, both from SBA as well as private sector organizations, such as the Chamber of Commerce. The Economic Innovation Group towards the bottom there, has a great one-page summary with all the small business loans available, and includes other stuff dealing with things that are not quite relevant to this group. And SBA also offers, we found out recently, small business disaster loans, economic disaster loans that have been awarded throughout the state of Virginia and DC, as well as several counties in Kentucky, Maryland, North Carolina, and Tennessee, and more information on the SBA website. Okay, so that's where we are so far. What are we doing next? They're already eyeing stimulus 4. This is what they're calling phase 4 in this. Many in Congress and throughout Washington and probably throughout the country consider the first 2 stimulus bills to have addressed the emergency, the current emergency. Stimulus 3, we were passed last week, was about mitigating the damage, getting resources to people, and resources to help businesses stay afloat. Now, phase 4 will be about recovery, economic recovery. And there's lots of talk. There's talk about shoring up some of the things that slipped through the cracks during the first few bills. But now there's a lot of talk about infrastructure in this bill. And frankly, state and local governments who feel like they were shortchanged in the first few bills. I mean, $150 billion going to state and local governments. They feel like they should have gotten a whole lot more than just that. So as always, they talk about highways, but infrastructure is increasingly, they're talking about drinking water, broadband, and electric grid improvements, which would mean quite a bit for our folks. So as you probably know, NUCA chairs the Clean Water Council. We're putting together a CWC letter for circulation to push for robust water and wastewater investment in Stimulus 4. I think the need for more underground fiber is underscored, as broadband right now is particularly impacted, as the shutdown has overwhelmed existing networks. It's interfering with kids getting homeschooled, just slow service. It kind of shows that we need a lot more broadband out there. We need to deploy more, and we know that fiber optic gets us there. So the shutdown is showing us that. So I would be very surprised if broadband didn't have a big place in the next bill. There are concerns about this already. So some folks are saying, I know Lindsey Graham from South Carolina said, we're already rushing to phase 4 before we even know if phase 3 is working. There's concerns that unemployment checks are taking 6 to 8 weeks to get out. There's concerns that checks are going to those who already have some income. There's also the concern that unemployment sometimes provides more money than current salaries, which can be a disincentive to work for some. So there are folks pushing back on even doing the Stimulus 4 yet. And obviously the optics, this is another thing I heard, is why are we talking about infrastructure when any and all of the focus should be on the coronavirus itself? It should be all about combating the coronavirus. Okay, so that's what we have for Stimulus 4. And we'll take questions at the end, but obviously a lot's happened. There's a lot coming up. To say that NUCA members and chapters are going to be invaluable moving forward. It's not a time to take a sideline position. So please help us out on our advocacy efforts moving forward. I do want to talk about, and Doug mentioned this, the whole essential workforce thing. So DHS, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Act, was established as part of the Department of Homeland Security to provide strategic guidance and coordinate federal efforts to ensure the security and resilience of critical infrastructure. On March 19th, CISA released its Essential Critical Infrastructure Workforce Advisory List, which was supposed to help state and local government entities protect their communities while ensuring the continuity of infrastructure and functions that are critical to public health and safety, as well as economic and national security. So they issued this list of essential workforce, if you will, 16 sectors, including water, energy, communications, and critical manufacturing, all of which impact NUCA members, or NUCA members are part of those sectors. When we saw that, NUCA sent a letter almost immediately, I think it was on the 21st, to CISA, encouraging them to include the utility construction industry as far as being essential. And we also signed on a multi-industry letter that collectively covered 24 of the essential job functions described in the original CISA guidance. So in other words, banding together with other contractor groups, we showed that, we're the guys doing the building. This stuff is contracted out, and we should not be overlooked. On the 28th, just a couple of days ago, CISA released its second version of the guidance, where workers repairing water and wastewater conveyances, NUCA members, and performing sampling and monitoring, including field staff. Also, workers supporting the operation, inspection, and maintenance is the key there, of essential public works, including bridges, water and sewer main breaks, construction of critical or strategic infrastructure. And I won't mention the other two, but I'm sure some folks out there deal with, digital systems supporting public works and road clearing site work. And it's important to remember that there was similar language that included NUCA members who do infrastructure work in other sectors: communications, broadband, electric, energy, and critical manufacturing. So the associates were not overlooked in this. Was included in that second version of the guidance. And earlier this week, Doug Carlson sent a memo to the membership notifying them of these developments. This is good news, folks. So I got to tell you, their states are going to do different things with this. Some are just going to follow the federal guidelines. Some are going to add to it. Some are going to take some and leave some. But it's imperative that the chapters, local members, communicate with your chapters. Chapters communicate with us. And please keep me in the loop as to what's going on in your state. And I've talked to some of you, and these things aren't changing by the week; they're changing by the hour. But the good news is, I think it looks right now, at least for right now, the feds do consider NUCA member services to be essential. It's important to remember that this is not a mandate or a federal directive. This is guidance, and states are doing different things all the time. I think the hope over time, and hopefully we're talking days and not several weeks, that the states are working towards standardizing a policy for essential services, and our guys will continue to be able to work. I want to allow some time for your questions. And again, let me underscore, we don't really know a lot of the answers to what you're going to ask me. So bear with me, though. We're going to collect your questions, and I will get you an answer when it's available. So Bob, with that, I'll give it back to you.
Thank you, Eben. We actually have a few questions right now. I'll start from the first ones and work my way down. First question is, and this goes with the paid leave requirements, why are companies with over 500 employees exempted from the paid leave requirements?
That's a good question, and they're getting a lot of flack for that. And I think they're going to have to deal with that. I'm surprised that some of the Democrats actually allowed that to happen. But let me find out exactly what is with that, because I thought that they still were subject to it to some form, but I've read several things about how they haven't even touched people, companies with over 500. So I don't have an answer for you. I think a lot of people are asking that same question, but certainly you'll be reading about that from me and from other folks in the industry.
The next question is on unemployment expansion. How does this work with state unemployment? Washington State's maximum unemployment is $775. If an additional $600 is added on top of that, that we're going to have issues retaining any employees that are currently laid off, or we're going to have issues retaining any employees that are currently laid off, that extra money being on there.
No, I think that's right. I think that's one of the concerns is if you put $600 on top of the existing, it's kind of hard to get them back. I mean, it's kind of a disincentive, but it's one of, you got to remember though, you had a virus that was spreading like wildfire, faster than wildfire. And Congress did what they thought was the right thing to do quickly. I think that's something that's going to come back and bite them though. And it's a concern that's being shared quite often, frankly.
Next question is, with the increasing talk about infrastructure, is there any chance to get the hours reduced for apprenticeship programs so we can get more people in our industry?
Hadn't thought of that. That's a great idea. And I guarantee you, I worked with some other groups, and that's something that I think we could get several associations to sign on to supporting that. I think that's a great idea.
All right, thank you, Evan. The next question is, the CISA document from DHS is only a guidance document. Should we be lobbying to make it mandatory?
I think that is a touchy one. I guess we could. I guess we'd have to look at it and make sure that there are other things in there that we don't want to see become federal law. And I know we'll get pushback, but let me ask around some of the other infrastructure groups. Because there was concern that especially on the contracting side, that it was all going to be out about operations and keeping the water systems running, keeping the broadband operations going, but not building and repairing. Let me ask about that. That's a interesting thought.
And our final question I've received, some of our work is in repair, but a lot of it is in new infrastructure. For our crews that are installing new infrastructure, what is the risk associated with keeping those crews working?
That's another great question. And I've heard from some of the chapter execs. I've heard that there have been complaints about crews, whether it's repair or new, is actually crews exercising social distancing. And I'm thinking in some cases, you just can't do that. I think when a water main breaks, it's going to be very hard to say our guys shouldn't be out there fixing it. But when it comes to new construction, I would say that on water, sewer, and frankly on broadband, it's hard to argue that we shouldn't be rebuilding. On the highway side, and taking nothing away from our friends in the surface transportation industry, although you're keeping people at work, new construction is a harder sell than fixing existing infrastructure. So there's certainly, I think you'll see an increasing focus or increasing distinction between new construction and repair and maintenance, if that makes sense.
Thank you, Eben. Recording this webinar will be made available to all registrants in the next day or two, and will also be available on the NUCA.com website at NUCA.com/webinar. We'll also be placing it on our pandemic flu resources as well, too. I also want to thank you to our sponsor, CNA, that's very generous. And thank you for your time today to join us for this webinar Wednesday, supporting NUCA. Please know we are there for you during this uncertain time, and we're working with many officials and private industry leaders to find the right path out of this national crisis for our members. Thank you for your time this afternoon, and please enjoy the rest of your week.